guess we're going to get started. So UConn College Libertarians welcomes Jonathan Rauch and Flemming Rose to talk about the need for free speech from the perspective of people marginalized for their voices. With this in mind, I want to briefly introduce both speakers before letting them sort of tell their stories. So Jonathan Rauch is a senior fellow in the Governance Studies program and author of 6 books and many articles on public policy, culture, and government. He is a contributing editor of The Atlantic and the recipient of the 2005 National Magazine Award, the magazine industry's equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize. His many Brookings publications include the 2015 ebook, Political Realism, How Hacks, Machines, Big Money, and Backroom Deals Can Strengthen American Democracy, as well as research on political parties, marijuana legalization, healthcare, and more. In 2013, he published Denial, My 25 Years Without a Soul, a memoir of his struggle with his sexuality, brought out as an ebook from the Atlantic Books. His previous book was Gay Marriage, Why It Is Good for Gays, Good for Straights, and Good for America, published in 2004 by the Times Books. His forthcoming book, A Constitution of Knowledge, is forthcoming and relevant when it's not clear what is true and what is false in the era of fake news. Flemming Rose is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. He previously served as a foreign affairs editor and cultural editor at the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten. During his tenure as culture editor, Rose was principally responsible for the September 2005 publication of the cartoons that initiated the Muhammad cartoons controversy in early 2006. Since then, he has been an international advocate for freedom of speech and the author of several books, including Tyranny of Silence, published by the Cato Institute in 2014. So we're going to start off by giving both of these panelists 7 minutes to talk about their stories for people who aren't familiar with them, and then we'll sort of flow into conversation. Let's start with Jonathan.
Thank you, Isidore. And it's always a special privilege to appear side by side with Flemming Rose, a genuine hero, someone who's done something I've never had to do, which is display physical courage in defense of my principles. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm not quite as happy about the need to be here today. I am a gay American. I was born in 1960, a very different world. This was a time when, how do I describe it? You couldn't turn on the radio without hearing a preacher dispatch me to hell, say that I was molesting children, that I was bringing God's wrath down upon the country. We couldn't work for the government. We couldn't get a security clearance to be a contractor for the government. We couldn't serve in the military. The psychiatric profession said that we were sick, diseased, mentally ill. Some of us were sent for cures that involved electroshock and even on occasion lobotomies. We were beaten up on the streets. When we called the police, they were in on it. The police loved to harass and jail homosexuals, and that was fun for them because it was just a misdemeanor charge, but it would show up and in the paper, and the next day you'd lose your job. And some people committed suicide when their families found out. Many people were trapped in loveless marriages. I could go on and on. It was not a good scene, and it's the reason I stayed in the closet until I was 25 years old. Now I'm 60, and I have been married for 10 years to a man, and that is legal across the country. I still remember when I was, I think 35, I was with my father of blessed memory, and I told him that I was going to become an advocate publicly for same-sex marriage, and he advised me in the strongest terms not to do that. He said, it wasn't that he had anything against gay people. At that point, I was out to him. He knew my partner. He was comfortable with it. But he said, I'll never forget, he said, John, if you come out in favor of that, people will think you're so crazy that it will destroy your credibility as a journalist. And that seemed plausible at the time. And that wasn't all that long ago. There are probably some people on this call who were around and remember 1995. So what accounts for this amazing change in my lifetime? The answer is 2 words: free speech. It was our voices that allowed this to happen. It was relentlessly making what was at the time the most unpopular argument in the world. if there had been hate speech laws in America in the 60s and 70s when I grew up, they would have been used against gay people because we were supposedly haters who were out to molest children. In fact, it wasn't until 1958 that we even got the right to speak, when the Supreme Court overturned the ban. The government actually banned the first openly gay magazine. It's astonishing. It's just 2 years before I was born. I'm not alone in thinking that we could never have achieved our freedom. Our civil rights without the ability to hate. Lamented John, one of the heroes of the civil rights movement, used to say that without freedom of speech and the right to dissent, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. Much earlier, Frederick Douglass, of course, probably one of the greats of the 19th century America and the freedom movement, said again and again that with true free speech, the shackles of slavery wouldn't last 5 years in the South. And this is all true. So one reason I was eager to talk to you all today and interact with you and be here is that nothing really breaks my heart more today as a lifelong gay activist and activist for equality than to learn that in so many places, including a lot of college campuses, people have somehow come to the idea that freedom of speech is a conservative idea, a reactionary idea, a colonialist or oppressive idea, that is unfair in some ways. That's not true at all. This is what we rely on in order to make the converts that we need in order to win politically, in order to change hearts and minds. I can tell you from my experience that it works. I'll never forget 2004, I had a book out on gay marriage. And I was on the hustings making the case. You got to remember, at that point, gay marriage was a nutty idea. 31 out of 30 possible states passed initiatives to ban it. Arizona voted twice. But I was on this radio show and someone called, I was making the case, and some guy calls in, as they do, and says to the host, you know, this guest you have on today is the most dangerous person in America. And the host said, why is that, caller? And the man said, because he's making it sound so damn reasonable. And that's when I knew we might win. That's when I knew that the arguments on our side could convey this thing. We see again and again that where there are hate speech laws, where there is deplatforming, authorities, majoritarian authorities or authoritarian authorities use those against minorities. Flemming Rose wrote an entire book about that. We know this again and again. When in Canada passed a feminist law against hate speech and pornography and stuff like that, the very first thing the Canadian authorities shut down was a lesbian bookstore. That's how the world works. So I guess the thought I'd like to leave on the table is that minorities are better off in a society that protects hate speech and obnoxious speech than in a society that protects minorities from hate speech and obnoxious speech. Because the problem with hate speech isn't the speech, it's the hate. And trying to fix that by canceling or censoring the speech is like trying to solve global warming by breaking all the thermometers. Over to you, Flemming.
Thank you, Jonathan. And, you know, I want to return the kind praise you said about me. I think your book, Kind Inquisitors, is one of the best book I've read about free speech and why free speech is so essential to knowledge production. And you wrote it at a time when this was not at the top of the agenda as it is today. And it's still a very topical book that all of those who are watching us tonight could benefit from reading. I will also say a few words about my personal story and how I became a blasphemer. But I want to say in the beginning that I acknowledge that that speech can be hurtful and painful. Well, you know, you have the saying, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can't hurt me. I think that's a very beautiful saying, but I don't think it's true, even though I will not equate words with violence in any way. And I think it's a disastrous road to go down. But I think we have to acknowledge, as free speech advocates, that speech can be painful and hurtful. But that is not an argument for criminalizing it, or even call on people not to say things that other people might perceive as hurtful. But my own story is the following. In fact, I am a foreign correspondent by profession. I spent 14 years abroad as a correspondent in the former Soviet Union and in the United States. And I returned to Denmark in 2004 and took up a job as the culture editor of the newspaper I used to work at, Jyllands-Posten in Denmark. And in the late summer of 2005, a Danish children's writer went public saying that he had written a book about the life of the Prophet Muhammad for children, but that he had problems finding an illustrator for his book. And that was a big story in Denmark. It was on the front page of most newspapers, and I think the majority of newspapers published the illustrations from his book. And it's also part of the story that the illustrator who did those drawings insisted on anonymity, which in my book is a form of self-censorship. You do not want to appear under your own name because you are afraid of what might happen to you. So in that sense, there is a difference between self-censorship and good manners. I'm a strong supporter of good manners, but I don't like self-censorship. And in the aftermath of this story about this children's writer, we asked people in Denmark in cultural life what they were thinking about this. And, some people were saying, well, there is self-censorship. Others were saying, no, there is no self-censorship. Some were saying, well, there might be self-censorship, but it's not based in reality. And others were claiming otherwise. So we had these questions on the agenda, and as a journalist, as an editor, when you hear about a problem, you want to find out if it's true or not. And in this case, a reporter suggested, why don't we ask illustrators in Denmark to draw the Prophet Muhammad to find out if there is a problem or not? And that's the reason why I got in touch with Denmark's Cartoonist Association, and I invited the members of that association to draw the Prophet as they see him. It was a very open invitation, and if you Google Danish cartoons, you can see that they are very different. They are not stereotyping or demonizing. They're very different, both in whom they are targeting for satire and the way they depict the Prophet Muhammad. And I received 12 cartoons, and those cartoons were published in September 2005. And I wrote a text explaining why we were doing this. And in the beginning, not much happened, but 3 months later, the world erupted in violence, and Danish embassies in Lebanon, Syria, and Iran were attacked and set on fire. A couple of years later, Al-Qaeda attacked the Danish embassy in Pakistan, and several people were killed. You had the attack in January 2015 in Paris, where many of my colleagues and friends were killed because they had republished these cartoons back in 2006. And even though, this happened many years ago, it's more than 15 years, in fact, I and some of the people who were involved in the publication back then still have to live with bodyguards around the clock. You know, I cannot leave my house here in peaceful Denmark. It's in fact one of the less violent and most peaceful countries in the world, and I have been covering wars abroad as a foreign correspondent, and I've never had to live with this kind of security that I have to do now. What have I learned? I think I have learned that that free speech, in fact, is a very rare creature. And, you know, I grew up part of a generation that took freedom of expression for granted. And I have learned also from listening to Jonathan, in fact, that freedom of expression is always under threat by definition, because there will always be powerful forces trying to silence what other people say because we disagree about a lot of things. And I share Jonathan's key point that I regret that among a lot of young people today, freedom of expression is considered a license among the powerful to attack minorities or people with less power. And if you look at history, nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, if you look at history and the history of all minorities and oppressed groups, their key ally in their struggle for rights and recognition has been publicity and freedom of expression. And if there's one point that you will take away from this exchange today, I hope it will be that freedom of expression, in fact, is the key weapon and a key ally for social movements for change throughout history. Thank you.
Very good, very good. I think you guys both gave really compelling answers. And I want to sort of start by asking whether or not free speech is primarily a cultural or a legalistic norm, and whether or not free speech should be one or the other. I mean, surely a lot of us would object to people arguing for or on behalf of slavery and other things. Wouldn't that be a form of self-censorship if we consider this to be primarily culture? Like, how do we go about this?
Who first? Do you have a preference?
Let's start with you, Jonathan.
I'll take this one first. You take the next one if we both want to come into it. Isidore, that's such a profound and important question. And lurking behind it is a point that's very important and very correct. The First Amendment in America is a crucial bulwark for freedom of expression. And by the way, also freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. This is the First Amendment for a reason. The founders understood without freedom of expression, nothing else in a democracy will work. The first thing an authoritarian or totalitarian government will do is try to silence dissent and reduce the flows of alternative channels of information. But something else the founders said that they were right about and that we're relearning today is that the law is not enough. You also need to have a culture of robust expression. Now, that doesn't mean a culture of rudeness. Flemming said at the beginning something I think is important. I think the way you're going to hear us talk today is the way we think people usually should talk, which is you try to be civil. You try to understand the other person. You don't want to, I don't offend people on purpose. I try to be agreeable, and most of the time we should. But as H.L. Mencken said, there is no truth, no important truth has ever come into this world that wasn't at first greeted as if it were a wave of smallpox. Many important new ideas, including same-sex marriage, including gay equality, including the idea that I'm not sick right now, that I don't belong in some kind of mental institution. These were all radical, dangerous ideas at the time that they were introduced. So we have to understand that you can't have moral progress and you can't have the progress of knowledge without dissent, without genuine intellectual pluralism, without a lot of people saying a lot of different things and challenging conventional wisdom, sometimes in stupid and wrong-headed ways. And you have to have a culture that allows that, not just laws that allow it. Long answer. I'll wrap up with some relevant and kind of disturbing information. There have been any number of surveys now of college campuses, and they find that consistently upwards of 60% of American students say that they do not feel free to speak their mind on important issues for fear of being socially punished for that. This is not the speech code. This is not the administration coming down. They're worried on what their friends will say on social media, whether anyone will have lunch with them again. And we actually see similar numbers, not quite as high in the American public as a whole. Something like a third of Americans now are worried that if they speak what's really on their mind about politics, their job could be in jeopardy. So this is a bad situation. This is a culture where people are feeling repressed. And that's an unhealthy situation because repression always comes out sideways in the form of movements that I personally think are much more dangerous, like Trumpism.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, but I'll just add maybe a point or two. I think you can have very good laws and you can have a strong protection of free speech in law, but at the same time don't have free speech in reality. And I think, in fact, that is one of the challenges that you are having right now in the United States, because United States has the best protection of speech anywhere in the world through the First Amendment. All other countries in the world have insult laws, blasphemy laws, hate speech laws, very broad defined libel laws, and so on and so forth. But the social pressure on speech in the US is way stronger than in many European countries. So I will say, why in the US you have strong legal protection, you have more social pressure on speech, while in Europe you have worse legal protection, but less social pressure on speech. And I think the key challenge here is to get back to the roots of the concept of tolerance. Right now, it seems to me that the relationship between freedom and tolerance has been distorted. They are being seen as kind of opposites that need to be balanced against one another. And if you say, something hurtful, then you are intolerant. While in fact it is the other way around. I believe that tolerance and freedom are two sides of the same coin, and that we need to reinvent tolerance in order to promote freedom of expression, meaning that to me, tolerance implies the ability to live with things that you actively dislike or hate without resorting to violence, threats, intimidation, or bans. And that is also the essence of freedom of expression. And that's why these two fundamental concepts, they go hand in hand. And the more they diverge in a society, the worse the status of freedom of expression. I mean, in Stalin's Soviet Union, you had freedom of expression, I think, on the books in the constitution, but you had no freedom of expression in reality. And I think much of the slide backwards to authoritarianism today in Russia has to do with the lack of a culture of freedom of expression. Because if you look at the Russian constitution, it's in fact very similar to the constitution of France. And even though I will not say that France is an exemplary liberal democracy, I would say it's a militant democracy. It's far more free than Russia, in spite of the fact that the legal foundations are more or less similar.
Isidore, I can't resist just briefly appending to that Fleming's exactly right, but Flemming, as you know, this is not a new problem in America. In 1840, Alexis de Tocqueville, a Frenchman, came to the United States and wrote a masterpiece called Democracy in America. And one of his main points was this: I know of no country where in general there reigns less independence of mind and true freedom of discussion than in America. In America, the majority draws a formidable circle around thought. Within those limits, the writer is free, but woe to him if he dares to go beyond them. It isn't that he has to fear being burned at the stake, but he is exposed to all types of distasteful things and to everyday persecutions. Well, he's describing cancel culture.
Great.
Yeah, on that same note, I kind of want to ask about moral backsliding. A lot of us, probably all of us on this call, think people yelling racial slurs at each other is a bad thing. Can those reasonably be controlled on a college campus without infringing upon freedom of speech? And how do you avoid the issue of intimidation or threats regarding that sort of action? Let's start with you, Flemming.
Yeah, I don't spend much time on college campuses, especially not in these COVID-19 times when I'm confined to Denmark. But I mean, college campuses are not that much different. I mean, human beings are there to do something, and I think it's very much a question of culture, and it's true that young people feel vulnerable. It's easier to get hurt, maybe. So I think it's nice to be careful and build trust. I think, in fact, also trust is important to a free flow information and exchanges of opinions, that you feel you can say what you think without getting cancelled or outed or whatever. So I think it's I mean, I also think it's important to keep in mind that we all make mistakes. I mean, and that's a key part of in Jonathan's book, Kindly Inquisitors. That we are fallible, and what we say needs to be investigated and criticized and so on and so forth. So I think this notion that if you say something hurtful one time and then you get kicked out or get excluded, I think that's not the right way to approach these things, because we make mistakes and we are fallible and we have to learn in the process. So I feel it's far more important that we can build trust, and if people say something hurtful, that we can have a conversation about why this happened, why did you say that, how was it perceived by other people, and what can we take away from that situation, instead of condemning and one another.
If we have time for a supplemental answer, I think all that is exactly right. On the specifics, there's kind of a legal answer to your question, and there's kind of a political answer to your question. I'll take the question to be, what should colleges and universities do about abusive and obnoxious and hateful speech when it arises? The first thing to say is there's not actually very much of it. American college campuses are probably the safest places for minorities in the history of the planet. It's not to say it never happens and it's not a concern. But let me tell you, as an atheistic homosexual Jew, I feel safer on an American college campus than anywhere else. So having said that, there's a lot of water under this bridge. We don't have to start from scratch answering that question, because we got pretty good guidelines in First Amendment jurisprudence. They don't apply to private colleges. They probably shouldn't. But the principles are kind of like this. So you cannot target an individual with persistent threats or harassment. That's illegal under US law. Notice that can be, that distinction doesn't depend on the political sentiment, for example. It's not a statement like affirmative action is counterproductive. But if Flemming follows me around on campus all day, shouting kike, kike, goddamn kike, that's illegal. That can be prohibited. That is a direct personal threat. But also notice that if he follows me around on campus all day shouting genius, genius, goddamn genius, that would also be targeted harassment. So you can't do that. That's a place where you can draw a line. Another place is inciting violence. And another place on a university campus, I think, is if you use speech to silence others. By silence, I don't mean you protest. Protesting is fine. But if you're making it impossible for other students or speakers on campus to be heard, or for other students to hear other points of view, that's an illiberal way to behave. And that should be, I think, against the rules on college campuses. So there's a political answer to this question too, or maybe epistemic, which is there's no such thing as hate speech. There's no such thing as a clearly defined notion of stuff that you can or cannot say. I don't like the prescription on the so-called N-word for the same reason that we gay people adopted the word queer. We need to encounter these ideas. We need to detoxify them. We need to understand what's going on behind them. And it's bad for the intellectual climate if you can't have those discussions and confront these hard ideas. And we also don't agree on what this speech is. Something I like to do on college campuses is ask for a show of hands. I ask the students to say, how many of you would say that the following constitutes hate speech? Homosexuality is an intrinsically disordered condition. And about half the students will raise their hand. So, and then I say, does anyone know what that actually is? That's Catholic doctrine right now. That's what, 500 million people around the world, including many people on this campus, believe that. Are we going to say you can't think or say that on this campus? I disagree with it, but I want to discuss it. I keep reminding people, I'm not gay people. People like me, we are not fragile flowers. We will not break if we're confronted with ignorance or even hatred. We will talk back. I have a harassment policy, which is, these bias incident reporting systems. I guess you have one at UConn. I'm generally against them, but there is one I'm in favor of, which is if someone's biased against me, report it to me. Come tell me about it. We'll have a conversation. We'll both learn something.
Excellent answers, both of you. I want to sort of move a little bit off of college campuses for a little bit, more towards a worldwide perspective, since I believe, Flemming, you're a little bit more familiar. Hate speech legislation in Europe. Is it an acceptable way of limiting the power of hateful groups, or is it an infringement upon civil liberties, or a combination of both? I believe Germany makes it illegal to deny that the Holocaust happened, but a lot of people don't see that as infringing upon free speech. What's your opinion on that?
That's what I will call a leading question.
You're ready for that one.
I'm softball, but I mean, I'm a strong advocate for abolishing hate speech laws and blasphemy laws and all kinds of insult laws, both for principal reasons, but also for practical reasons, because I think they do not serve their aim. And they very easily become a tool in the hands of authoritarian regimes to clamp down on minorities and dissenting voices. And I mean, just to remind the audience, this is exactly the warning that Eleanor Roosevelt, as the chairman of the UN Human Rights Committee, right after World War II, when states were discussing these rules, she warned against the phrasing in the UN Convention on Political and Civil Rights against hate speech, and her words were prophetic. In fact, it turned out that these laws have basically been used to either silence minorities, but also to criminalize dissenting voices, like Jonathan just said about the way Catholics now condemn gay people. That was the mainstream view maybe just 30 years ago. but it's not the mainstream view anymore. I think that, I mean, it's not only Germany, just to remind you, I think it's 16 or 17 countries now in Europe who have, that have Holocaust denial laws. And because we have Holocaust denial laws, there are also countries in the former communist bloc who had passed laws criminalizing denial of the crimes of communism. There's been passed laws criminalizing the denial of the Armenian genocide, and so on and so forth. So that even in Russia now, copied on the German Holocaust denial law, they have a law criminalizing criticism of the behavior of the Red Army during World War II, which means that my good friend Antony Beevor, who wrote a great book, several great books about World War II, but the fall of Berlin in 1945, when Soviet soldiers committed a lot of atrocities, he can't go to Russia anymore. And this is all rooted in this principle that you can have these memory laws protecting a certain version of history. And I think that's very wrong, and it's not working. I mean, I think a big problem in Europe right now is that we are, for the past 20, 30 years, we've had a huge migration from the Middle East. And a lot of the Muslims who are coming to Europe are Holocaust deniers, because, that's what they have been taught in school. And the fact that they are not able to air their prejudices and wrong opinions means that we cannot have an exchange. And it just reinforces, their opinion that the Jews are ruling the world. Also in Europe, you do not. I don't know of a single example when bans or criminalization have changed people's minds. That only happens in the process of exchange and good arguments.
Yeah, I couldn't possibly improve on that answer, but just a couple little supplements that I might add. One is that people have looked now at how effective hate speech laws and other prescriptions of speech are in Europe at actually reducing the amount of extremism and violence and dissension. And it turns out, predictably, they really can't find that they help. One of my favorite parts of Flemming's book is where he walks through something that a lot of people don't know. The Weimar Republic in Germany had hate speech laws, and they were used to prosecute the Nazis. And the result of that is what the result often was, which was that they gave Adolf Hitler a platform in which to pose as a martyr, to say, I'm being silenced, so I must be right. He put posters up all over, the Nazis did, with slogans like, crooks can speak anywhere in Germany, but Hitler is banned. And of 2 billion people in the world, he alone is banned from speaking in Germany. So they exploited these laws. And then, of course, when they came to power, they cracked down much harder on speech. So these laws, if they worked, we'd be having a different conversation, but they don't seem to.
Mm-hmm. To the contrary, I would say, in fact. And once they are on the books, in fact, Hitler used some of the laws that the Social Democrats had used against the Nazis. And he said to the Social Democrats, why are you so angry? I mean, you're just using your laws. And of course, he would have done it anyway. But I think if you take a country like Pakistan, they have some of the most severe blasphemy laws in the world. And I think, in fact, you can make the argument that blasphemy laws in Pakistan, they function as incitement to violence, because a lot of people take the law in their own hands, and they kill what they see as blasphemers. And in Pakistan, the crime of blasphemy is equal to a terrorist act if you kill 500 people. Salman Rushdie called blasphemy, I think, a victimless crime, and I think that's true. and in Pakistan they also used to attack Muslim minorities. The Ahmadi Muslims in Pakistan is a Muslim minority that are not recognized by the Sunnis as true Muslims, and they are being persecuted, while we are speaking here.
Excellent. So I wanted to follow up that question with you guys have been mentioning a lot of examples of hate speech legislation with the goal of silencing speech or silencing bad speech. What are the prospects of free speech worldwide, and have they been getting better or worse? Let's start with you, Jonathan.
The answer to that question is yes. Next question.
Yeah.
The explanation for that answer, have they been getting or worse? The answer is always yes to that question. So I say this every opportunity I get, because sometimes if you're on my side of the arguments, you can feel a little bit overwhelmed. I remind people that the most counterintuitive and strange idea, social idea in all of human history, is that speech which is wrong-headed, bigoted, blasphemous, seditious, dangerous, that these things should not only be allowed in a free society, but should be protected in a free society. This is the most strange, counterintuitive, and crazy sounding idea ever, bar none. And its only saving grace as an idea is that it is also the single most successful social principle in all of human history, because it creates the idea of intellectual pluralism, of true viewpoint diversity, where people can disagree, but no one has the authority to set one correct point of view or one sacred point of view and impose that on everyone else. That's where freedom comes from. It's where knowledge comes from. Most important to me, it's where peace comes from, because society where you have authoritarian control of information and truth is a society where people are always at war over controls over that. But here's the problem. Because this is the most counterintuitive social idea of all time, you, Flemming, and I, and you, Isadore, and everyone on this call, and your children, and their children, and their children, etc., will have to get up every morning for the entire rest of history and explain this idea from scratch. We'll have to justify it again and again against constantly metamorphosing different views. There will be constant new challenges to it all the time. And guess what? We just have to be cheerful about that, because actually in the big scheme, we're doing very well. When my grandfather was alive, the greatest English language novel of the 20th century in America was burned on the docks, Ulysses. It was illegal and it was burned by government agents. In my father's lifetime, when he was still in his 20s, the first gay magazine, not pornographic, Essays, was banned by the government. You can't do that anymore. So on some fronts, we're making fantastic progress. On others, we're slipping back. And one of those, I think, is the cultural problem that Flemming talked about. So we just got to keep at it.
Great answer. Can I add just one point? I don't know if you think, Jonathan, that we have had a golden age of free speech. In Denmark, I think maybe from the 80s to the 2000s, and this new cultural thing to go, and identity politics and what have you. But I think in a way, and you also say that we are in a pretty good place overall. And I think one of the ironies, or maybe the paradox of our time, is that in fact that we should not forget that due to the digital technology, more people than at any time in history have a voice. If you have a smartphone, you can communicate your thoughts and ideas to billions of people. But at the same time, we never had so much regulation of speech. And I think, in fact, these two trends are interconnected in the sense that due to this explosion of speech online, especially, authorities around the world are, trying to put new limitations in place in order to regulate all this speech. And I think we still have to work out, norms, how to interact. Here we can see one another's faces, but a lot of communication online and on social media goes on between people who don't know one another. They cannot see one another. They are not accountable in any way, and a lot of that speech used to be private conversations that are now open out in the public, and we have to learn how to handle that. But I think we should not forget that in spite of all our criticism of digital platforms and social media, that in fact a lot of people that never had a chance to say, like what they think now have that opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'd only add, as people will find out if they pre-order or read my forthcoming book. Did I mention I have a forthcoming book available for pre-order on Amazon? I think if there is a challenge in America that's even more pressing than these cultural challenges of what's been called cancel culture, I call it coercive conformism. It's the new phenomenon of what's been called censorship by noise, which is disinformation tactics that are very effective at essentially drowning out truth, drowning out careful conversation, and swamping it with combinations of lies, half-truths, insults, outrage. This is a big problem, and we're seeing it in America right now in a big way. And it's hard to cope with because it's not a conventional free speech issue. It's not about government limiting speech. It's actually an assault really on attention, really more than speech. Speech is no longer a scarce resource, as Flemming, as you just said, but attention is a very scarce resource. And if you can divert it away from truth and into trolling, you have a powerful weapon of disinformation, political destabilization.
It sounds like you guys are leading into my next question.
Social media, right?
I was going to ask about fake news and harm and how your perspective in your previous book, Kindly Inquisitors, or perhaps your coming book, A Constitution of Knowledge, would sort of deal with this approach. Give us a teaser.
So yeah, it's good timing because I just launched into that a moment ago. We're at a point of epistemic crisis in America where we have millions of people who believe the fake news that the election was won by Donald Trump, that there was massive cheating. I could go on and on. You know about QAnon, you know about everything else. We now have an entire conservative media establishment, which is in only partial touch with reality and functions in many ways like a disinformation network that amplifies rather than suppresses truth. There is no one simple answer to how you deal with that. The techniques that we're seeing used are not new techniques. They go back as far as Lenin. They're often called, what information experts call it, the fire hose of falsehood, which is you just drown people in so much misinformation. They become disoriented, confused, cynical. They don't know who to believe, so they'll believe anything. Putin does this very effectively. And Trump does it very effectively. And the answer is we don't know yet, but we know the direction the answer has to come from. And that's establishing institutions and norms and guardrails. It's what Flemming just alluded to. We've done this in the past when the printing press came into being. There was fantastic amounts of fake news. There was, this was used to persecute witches all across Europe. It set off a huge anti-witchcraft panic. It set off massive religious wars. It took a while to set up the norms and institutions of publishing that let us channel those forces positively. We saw similar channelings of the crazy media that we had in the 19th century. It was hyper-partisan and full of fake news. We saw in the late 19th century professionalization of media, the development of norms and standards. And now we're seeing the same thing. Facebook has created an institutional board that's going to try to set out some standards for how you deal with these things. Twitter is beginning to revise its platforms and its rules. So there's a lot of people grappling with these problems on and off social media. And it's going to take a lot of people doing a lot of different things to cope with it. Flemming asked before we started, am I optimistic or pessimistic? And the real answer is yes. This could go either way. But in the past, this is not cause for complacency, but in the past, we have faced information warfare and information revolutions. And we have figured out, it took a while, they were massively disruptive, but we have figured out how to cope with them. So there's grounds for hope.
Great answer. I just want to add one thing on fake news. You mentioned Vladimir Lenin. And if the audience doesn't know, I graduated in Russian language and literature. And I lived in Moscow for 12 years, I think, 11, 12 years as a foreign correspondent. And my if you read my book, you will see that that my views on free speech are in some ways more informed by my studying of the Soviet Union than having grown up in Denmark, because I got in touch with dissidents, and I got a real sense of what self-censorship can do to a society, and this intimidation and fear and oppression. But Vladimir Lenin, I mean, when the Bolsheviks were in the underground in pre-revolutionary Russia, they were censored by the Tsarist regime, and they all agreed when they were outside power that we had to get rid of censorship when we get into power. And just a few days after having taken over power in 1917, Lenin issued a decree banning all newspapers, or the vast majority of them, pointing to the fact that they should not be allowed to spread deliberate lies about the Soviet regime. So he was in fact using this instrument of fake news, that we need to stop the opposition press because they are distributing fake news. And I think if you look at history, if you look at the Soviet dissidents in the 70s, they were in fact imprisoned because they were accused of spreading falsities about the Soviet Union. So I think when people talk about, the need, it's right that we need to fight fake news and we have to find these epistemic solution. But when people talk about involving the government in this through laws, it really all alarm bells ring within me. Because this is an instrument that authoritarian regimes have used throughout history. And I will say that maybe the two key challenges for social media, these digital platforms, that's hate speech and misinformation. And we have to keep in mind that it's exactly hate speech and misinformation that have been used by authoritarian governments throughout history to silence dissent. And that's partly because, one man's hate speech is another man's poetry. And even though we need institutions to find out what is true and what is not, facts is also a sociological thing. I think one of Jonathan's heroes, Charles Sanders Peirce, said that knowledge is always social. So it's something that we agree about what the facts are within a community. And when you have this polarization, people do not always agree on the facts. My point is that we just have to be careful when people are using, hate speech and misinformation as a reason for calling for legal intervention in order to stop this.
Okay, I'm gonna step into the devil's advocate role for a second.
Facebook is tricky that way.
Okay, I was gonna say that even prior to the dissemination of social media, institutions that are considered trusted oftentimes abuse their trust. How do we sort of approach that? I mean, we all remember the Iraq War and various cover-ups. What tools need to be put in place to make sure that these institutions don't just become tools of the state and the powers that be? Let's start with you, Flemming.
I mean, I learned a lot from reading Martin Gurri's book, Revolt of the Public. And I think part of the panic today is due to the fact that old institutions have lost their authority. And there is a panic among elites because outsiders, if you remember Dan Rather, the former CBS anchor who had to resign in 2004, that was one of the first examples of how, online communities outside established media could fact check a report on the nightly news. And it turned out that this accusation that George W. Bush, I think he hadn't served in the army the way that he said, what turned out to be false. It was fabricated documents, and this ability for outsiders to check the gatekeepers and those in authority is part of this crisis. So I mean, I agree with you that that misinformation has been a problem, as long as people have been around, but it's just been far more difficult to identify it. So you can say, in a way, we have agreed upon a certain version of reality that every now and then wasn't true. But because we agreed about it, it wasn't that much of a problem.
I'm an outlier on this question because although I certainly think there have been problems with major institutions, to me, the bigger story of the United States, at least, and probably most of Europe, is not how poorly our institutions have performed, but compared with most of the institutions in most societies and most of history, how well they've performed. I wouldn't trade our Supreme Court, for example, or our Federal Reserve for any previous system. Our corporate sector is generally pretty clean and law-abiding. All kinds of abuses that we used to take for granted don't go on anymore. I tend to think, I think I'm the only person in America, maybe the world, who thinks this, but I think the problem in the US is not so much that the institutions have failed the people, it's that the people have failed the institutions. You've had 2 generations now who've come up with the very anti-institutionalist idea directly by the people without institutions. They only see the failures. They don't ask, did the institutions learn from the failures, which is really what we need them to be accountable to do, because institutions, like people, will make mistakes. So yeah, I'm on board with accountability and improved performance, that's for sure. But I'm also on board with trying to help the public understand a little better why institutions are so important and why a nihilistic attitude of just tearing them down because they're doing such a bad job, why this is definitely not the solution. I'd love, Isidore, I assume you're going to get there, but there's such a wonderful question from Michael Hernandez in the chat that I'd love to get a crack at it some point.
I don't see it, but yes, please take a crack at it.
It is, I hope Michael's still with us. I'll read it. Many minoritized and marginalized members, like myself, think outside the orthodoxy and have our own thoughts and beliefs, but they are not aligned with what the rest of society wants people like us to think. How do we stand up for ourselves in this climate? So, Michael, this is probably the single most frequent question I'm asked when I talk to people on college campuses. It's usually actually a straight white freshman or sophomore, but not always. I've had gay person ask me this question at one school, came up to me and said, you know, I'm not in tune with the LGBT group on campus. I'm a moderate progressive, and they're ostracizing me, they're shutting me out, they're shutting me down. What do I do about that? This question comes up again and again. What do I do when people try to disqualify me from conversation because of my race or my privilege or whatever? And I used to try to come up with snappy answers to feed them, and that didn't really work. And then I started saying, well, your generation needs to figure that out for yourself, because we don't really know how to talk to you. And those were both very unsatisfying answers. And then I finally came up with what I actually think is the right answer. It doesn't matter what you say to these people. It doesn't matter what you tell them. What matters is that you tell them and that you say. What matters is that you insist on not shutting up. As a homosexual person, I can tell you that I and all other gay activists were up against a wall of society that wanted us to go away. They wanted us to get off the planet. They would constantly say, even well-intentioned people would say about gay marriage, why do we even have to talk about this? I mean, I sympathize with you, but do we really have to discuss this? The most important thing what we can do is not let them take our voices away. Do not be intimidated. Do not be silenced. They actually cannot do much of anything to you if you continue to speak in a rational, forthright way. And here's the dirty little secret. The people on college campuses who are really trying to shut down the dialogue, deplatform people, and so forth, they're the minority on almost every campus. This is what surveys find. They don't speak for most students. What they're afraid of is that if you speak, Michael Hernandez, you'll find an audience with that big group out there that's less organized, but sympathetic. And that's your audience. That's who you're talking to. And a lot of them, those silent people out there, they will listen to you. The hardcore activists never will. But that other group, they will hear you. So the thing I say again and again is, I'm not in your shoes, and it's hard to have these conversations, especially if you're 19 years old, and those friendships and social relationships are so important, but just don't let them silence you.
Would you like to add anything, Flemming?
No, that was a great answer. I think what Jonathan stresses underlines a key point that the most important minority in any society is the individual, and it's quite often the minority within minorities that needs our attention. And even though you and I belong to a different generation, there are some general rules here at play that has to do with group psychology. That most people don't want to be outside in a group. They don't want to be dissenting, or they want to feel included or belong, and therefore it's always difficult to speak your mind if you think what you're saying is against the mainstream in a group. But I agree with Jonathan. It's about being yourself, but you will also quite often find out that you're not the only one who thinks the way you do. That most people are just silent because they, as you are, they are afraid or feel intimidated to speak their mind.
And you will be surprised.
I think, in fact, that one of the most important things in this conversation about freedom of expression is our focus on creating space for dissent in any group. I think dissent is of importance, even if people are, saying stupid things, because it forces us to open our mind to other points of view and engage with them. So we're not, live in these closed circles.
Yeah, two footnotes
field a question?
for Michael. Just two quick footnotes, if I may. I'll make them very quick. One is, it's important to remember what Flemming just said, which is diversity and inclusion are super important. We all agree on that. The most important type of diversity in an intellectual environment is viewpoint diversity. Make sure there are people around who disagree with you. Otherwise, you're in a bubble and you cannot find truth. You will not spot your biases. The second point also to Michael is, you will be surprised, actually, how powerful your voice can be, what a difference it can make. It took a while to get started on gay marriage and some of the other things we did. But the power of ideas, the power of the voice of argument, I like to say it's a big bomb, but it's on a long fuse. But you light that fuse and you keep at it, you will be amazed at the change that can occur.
Wow, that was really inspiring. I want to highlight my Thea Johnson's question, which I think is a really interesting one. Why do you think recently people have associated free speech with being conservative? Do you want to start, Flemming?
I don't know. But
I could take a crack at that one if you want to get off the hook.
Please go ahead.
Free speech is always a value that's cherished by the people who are out of power. And on American university campuses today, the large majority are progressives. And many of them are progressives who aren't particularly interested in hearing dissenting points of view, conservative points of view. We know that because there are surveys that tell us that. There's active discrimination against conservatives in hiring in a lot of university campuses. So right now, in this situation, it's typically going to be conservatives who are relying on freedom of speech, just as in a fascist society or a conservative society, it's going to be the progressives who are relying on freedom of speech, aren't about free speech. It's just the sociology on campus right now.
Okay, so I guess I'll ask another question while waiting for more questions. So does the social fabric of society require myths, like the myth of the metals, to keep people sane? Are there any truths that are particularly dangerous? And if these truths are particularly dangerous, how does one approach this? Do you want to start, Jonathan?
I didn't quite understand the myth of the metals.
I don't know. I mean, it depends.
Yeah, so
you might want to clarify that. I might also point out there's a question in the Q&A from Roy Matthews that we haven't got to yet.
We'll go to that one. I'm not getting it. Would you mind reading it?
Oh, yeah. And I'm happy to discuss what you just spoke. I just need a clarification again on the question. Roy Matthews said, the people failing the institutions. Thank you. That makes two of us. You and I can, form a movement. What went wrong with either the education system in the US or in the raising of these generations? Jonathan Haidt's The Coddling of the American Mind comes to mind when he points to helicopter parenting and a less free childhood. What are your thoughts, Mr. Rauch and Mr. Rose? So again, I can take an initial crack at that one if you want.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there's another one from, looks like maybe it's Ben Gladstone. It's a bunch of things, actually. We did have some big institutional failures in the 60s and 70s. Vietnam War comes to mind, inflation in the 70s. We also had institutional successes like the belated but eventually important response to the civil rights movement. But something that happened is that our institutions in the 40s and 50s and 60s seemed too impermeable to outsiders. And that made us think, well, these together too much. And we began to rebel against them. And that was important to question the American Psychiatric Association, which said we were sick. But that led, as so often in America, to a larger movement of people on all sides of the political spectrum saying basically institutions should get out of the way. You had progressives, social liberals saying, let's all have our own lifestyles, let 1,000 flowers bloom. You had libertarians basically saying government, many other social institutions are just barriers to freedom. And you had a lot of conservatives basically saying, let's just trust the market to do everything. So we lost sight of the importance of institutions in our cultural life. There's a wonderful book about this, which I can recommend, by Yuval Levin. I think it's one of the most important books of recent years, and it's short. It's called The Time to Build. And he works through why Americans sort of forgot about institution building and why they're so important and how we can build that back.
Yeah, I just.
Are you seeing the questions yet, Isidore?
I'm actually not getting all of them, but I've got a couple of them that I want to.
I think there is one more. I just want to add a point on the question about the coddling of the American mind. I don't think we have exactly the same way of parenting in Europe, and I think that's a very astute observation on their part, linking this overprotection of kids to the kind of problems we are now facing on college campuses with free speech. But I think also in Europe we have a growing tendency to value security and safety, psychological and mental safety and security more than we used to. And I wonder why, but I think maybe it has to do with the fact that in fact we are doing so well that we are used to, we live longer, we are wealthier. I read a statistics if on the US, if people should die from accidents, plane crashes, car accidents, murder, then the average lifespan in the US would be 9,000 years, meaning that it happens so rarely these days compared to not that long ago. And I think this sense of well-being on so many fronts maybe has the consequence where we are not used to face the kind of troubles that earlier generations had to face, and that's why we focus so much on mental comfort and psychological well-being, and it has this adverse effect on our understanding of freedom of expression.
Okay, I want to highlight Lisa J's question because I think it's a good one before moving on to Ben's. How can we as a society encourage more critical thinking instead of passive acceptance of trendy ideas? Do you want to start, Jonathan, and then follow it by Flemming?
Sure. Well, one level to answer that is better education, and we have a lot of work to do there. I'll give a very specific practical example, and then I'll give a broader point. The specific practical example is there's a new movement, which is really interesting. It's called debate-centered instruction, and it's beginning to find a foothold in secondary schools. And there's a related concept which is starting to spread across the country, and it's called Braver Angels debates. Braver Angels is a national grassroots depolarizing movement that I've been involved with. And the idea of both of those things is that the best way to teach critical thinking is to have people get out there and state a point of view, have to defend it. Even better in debate-centered in high school. And this is a fantastic way to learn that there are multiple points of view and that you don't need to collapse when you confront a point of view that's very different from your own. So improved pedagogy and that kind of approach, I think, would be very valuable. And I'm glad it's starting to get a hearing as people realize that, showing is better than telling. You can lecture people all you want about critical thinking, but there's no substitute for just standing up and having to do it. By the way, students love it. There's also evidence that the direct instruction of critical thinking is very helpful. For example, better preparing people to distinguish news literacy, that kind of program. The bigger answer is individually as humans, we're not very rational and we never will be. We're just not built that way as a species. What works is comparing and contrasting our views with others, critical exchange. And that's why intellectual diversity is. That's how we learn to be critical thinkers, and that's how we learn to learn. Looks like we lost Flemming, at least momentarily.
Okay, great. Well, we can keep just firing through these questions.
Yeah, he'll come back.
It's just speed around. So Ben Gladstone asks, as a moderate progressive, how do I support free speech within the progressive movement?
Speak. I think it's what I said earlier. It's don't be silenced. If there's someone I feel for, especially in a college campus situation where it's very trendy to be radical, it's the moderate progressive. It's someone who wants to make social change, but wants to be realistic about how that happens, and who, instead of, say, for example, word policing, telling people what they can and cannot say, instead wants to go out and canvass for a political candidate or work for the Democratic Party. And those positions are not very glamorous, but those are the people who actually make the difference at the end of the day. So I just think the most important thing that you can do if you're in that group is remember, you're the swing voter. You're the person in whose hands these elections, these key elections, so often come down to. And you're the person who's going to determine the intellectual climate on campus, because the radicals will always be there doing their thing. So stay involved, and for heaven's sake, don't shut up. Just don't shut up.
So I guess we can loop back to my question from earlier. I was referring to the myth of metals in Socrates' way of organizing society, as you mentioned in Kindly Inquisitors. And I was curious about whether or not there are any foundational myths that societies are founded upon, and whether or not in this way truth is dangerous. And if truth is dangerous, what should be done about it?
Well, of course, truth is dangerous. Truth is possibly the most dangerous force in history. If by dangerous you mean that it can be very disruptive, it can be very unpleasant. I quoted Mencken earlier to the effect that there isn't a single important truth that wasn't greeted at first as if it were a new wave of smallpox. So yeah, truth is dangerous. The problem is that the alternative to truth, which is ignorance, hate, and folly, are much more dangerous. And they're dangerous in a different way. So yeah, truth is dangerous, but that doesn't make it bad. Truth is also safe in the longer run. In fact, it's the only thing that's safe. So no, I guess I don't really think that there are foundational myths. I do feel it's important. We're not truth seekers. We're not, as I call it, liberal scientists, people who are engaged in public critical thinking in all aspects of our lives every day. When we go to church or synagogue, for example, we put that aside. and we prioritize our faiths and our faith communities. So yeah, there are very important parts of society that are foundational, that are not truth-seeking. But no, is there sort of some alternative truth, some grand social myth that we need to believe? I don't really think so.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for showing up, Jonathan. And Flemming, if you are there, I also want to appreciate you for your time. I hope this was an intellectually stimulating event. And I hope that you make some noise about the free speech legislation that's coming up on Wednesday, March 10th. For more information, please email me or reach out to me so we can talk about what we can do to get this sort of thing passed. Thank you, Jonathan.